you gotta do is read a book. Open up the cover and take a look.
Hi, my name is Ann-Lutz, and today I'm going to read a book to you about a little girl who feels dumb and stupid. Haven't we all felt that way at one point or another in our lives? This book tells us that we're not dumb and we're not stupid. Read with me. I hope it means as much to you as it does to me. Today I'm reading Thank You, Mr. Falker by Patricia Polacco. The grandpa held the bar of honey so that the family could see the drip ladle into the drizzle of honey, and on the cover of a small book. The little girl had just turned 5. "Stand up, little one," he cooed. "I did this for your mother and your uncle and your younger brother, and now for you." He handed the book to the little girl. "Taste." She dipped her finger in the honey and she put it in her mouth. "What does it taste like?" said her grandma. The little girl answered, "Sweet." Then all of the family said in one single voice, "Yes." And so is knowledge. But knowledge is like the bee that made that sweet honey. You have to chase it through the pages of a book. The little girl knew that the promise to read was at last hers. Soon she was going to learn to read. Patricia was the youngest girl in the family. She grew up loving books. Her schoolteacher mom read to her every night. Her red-headed brother brought books home from school and he shared them. And whenever she visited the family farm, her father or grandmother read to her while visiting next to the stone fireplace. When she turned 5, she went to kindergarten and most of all hoped to read. One day, she saw the kids in the first grade class across this hall reading, and before the year was over, some of the kids in her class began to read, but not Tricia. Still, she loved being in school because she could draw. The other kids would crowd around her and watch her do her magic with her crayons. "In first grade, you'll learn to read," said her brother. In first grade, Tricia sat in a circle with all the other kids, and they were all holding Our Neighborhood, their first grade reader, sounding out letters and words. They would say, oi, boy, and then look. The teacher smiled at them when they put on the sounds together and they got a word right. But when Tricia looked at the page, all she saw were wiggly shapes, and when she tried to sound out the words, the other kids laughed at her. "Tricia, what are you looking at in that book?" they'd say. "I'm reading," she'd say to them. But her teacher would move on to the next person, and always when it was her turn to read, the teacher had to help her with every single word. And while the other kids moved up into the second grade reader and the third grade reader, she stayed alone in Our Neighborhood. Tricia began to feel different. She began to feel dumb. The harder the words got for the little girl, the more and more time she spent drawing. Oh, she loved to draw. Just sitting and dreaming, or when she could, going for walks with her grandmother. One summer day, she and her grandma were walking together in the small woods behind their farm. It was twilight, and the air was sweet and warm, and fireflies were just starting to come out from the grasses. As they walked, Tricia said, "Grandma, do you think I'm different?" "Well, of course," her grandma said. "To be different is the miracle of life. You see each one of those little fireflies? Each one is different." "So, do you think I'm smart?" Tricia didn't feel smart. Her grandma hugged her. "You are the smartest, quickest, dearest little thing ever." Right then, as a little girl, she felt safe to be with her in her grandma's arms. Reading, it didn't matter so much. Tricia's grandmother used to say, that stars were holes in the sky, that they were the light from the heaven coming from the other side. She used to say that someday she would go to the other side, where the light was coming from. And one evening, they lay on the grass together and they counted the lights from heaven. You know, her grandma said, all of us will go there one day. Hang on to the grass. You'll lift right off of the ground and soon you'll be there. Well, they laughed and they both hung to the grass. But it wasn't long after that night that her grandma must have let go of the grass, because she went to where the lights were, on the other side. And not long after that, Tricia's grandpa let go of the grass too. School seemed harder and harder now. Reading was just plain torture. When Sue Ellen read her page or Tommy Bob read his page, they read so easily that Tricia would look at the top of their heads to see if there was something happening in their heads that wasn't happening to hers. The numbers were the hardest thing of all to read. She never gathered anything right. Line the numbers up before you put them together, the teacher would say. But when Tricia tried, the numbers looked like stacked blocks, wobbly, and they began to fail. She knew she was just dumb. Then one day her mother announced that she'd gotten a teaching job in California, a long way from the family farm in Michigan. Even though her grandma and grandpa were gone, the little girl didn't want to move. Maybe, though, the teachers and the kids in her new school wouldn't know just how dumb she was. She and her mom and her brother moved across country in a two-tone 1949 Plymouth. It took 5 days. At her new school, it was the same thing. She tried to read. She stammered over the word. The cat ran. She was reading like a baby in the 3rd grade. And when her teacher read along with them and called on Tricia for an answer, she always gave the wrong answer every time. "Hey, dummy," a little boy called out to her in the playground. "How come you are so dumb?" Other kids stood near him and they laughed. And Tricia could just feel the tears burning in her eyes. How she longed to be back with her grandparents on the farm in Michigan. Now, Tricia wanted to go to school less and less. "I have a sore throat," she would say to her mom, or "I have a stomach ache." She dreamed more and more and drew more and more, and she hated school. Then when Tricia was starting the 5th grade, the school was all abuzz. There was a new teacher. He was tall and elegant. Everybody loved his striped coat and his slit gray pants. He wore the neatest clothes. And all the usual teachers' pets gathered all around him. Stevie Joe and Alice Marie, Davy and Michael Lee. But right from the start, it didn't seem to matter to Mr. Falker. He didn't care which kids were the cutest or the smartest or the best at anything. Mr. Falker would stand behind Tricia when she was drawing, and he'd whisper, "This is brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Do you know how talented you are?" Oh, when he said this, even the kids who were teasing her would turn around in their seats to look at what she was drawing. But they still laughed at her whenever she gave a wrong answer. Then one day, she had to stand up and read, which she hated. She was stumbling through a page in Charlotte's Web, and the page was going all fuzzy, and the kids began to laugh out loud. And Mr. Faulkner, in his plaid jacket and his butterfly tie, said, "Stop! Are you all not so perfect that you can look at another person and not find fault with them?" That was the last day anyone laughed out loud or made fun of her, except for Eric. He had sat behind her for 2 years, and he seemed to almost hate her. Tricia didn't know why. He waited by the door of the classroom for her, and he pulled her hair. And he waited for her on the playground, and he leaned in her face, and he called her a toad. Tricia was afraid to turn around any corner for fear that Eric would be there. She just felt completely alone. The only time she was really happy was when she was around Mr. Falker. He let her erase the blackboards. Only the best students got to do that. He patted her on the back when she got something right, and he looked hard and mean at any kid who teased her. But the nicer Mr. Falker was to Tricia, the worse Eric treated her. He got all the other kids to wait for her on the playground or the cafeteria or even in the bathroom, and to jump out and call her stupid or ugly. Tricia began to believe them. She discovered that if she went to the bathroom just before recess, she could hide under the inside stairwell during the free time and not have to go inside at all. In the dark place, she felt completely safe. But one day at recess, Eric followed her to her secret hiding place. "Have you become a mole?" he laughed. And he pulled her out into the hall, and he danced around her. "Dumbbell, dumbbell, maggoty old dumbbell." Tricia buried her head in her arms, and she curled up in a ball. And suddenly she heard footsteps. It was Mr. Falker. He marched Eric down to the office, and when he came back, he found Tricia. "I don't think you have to worry about that boy again," he said softly. "What was he teasing you about, little one?" "I don't know," Tricia shrugged. Tricia was sure Mr. Falker believed that she could read. Well, she had learned to memorize what the other kids were reading who were sitting next to her were reading. Or she would wait for Mr. Falker to help her with a sentence, and then she'd say the exact same thing he did. "Good," he would say. Then one day, Mr. Falker asked her to stay after school and to help wash the blackboards. And he put on music, and he brought out little sandwiches, and they worked, and they talked. And at once he said, "Let's play a game. I'll shout out numbers, and you write them on the board with the wet sponge, just as quickly as you can." "A," he shouted, and she wiped out a watery A. "8," he shouted, and she made a watery 8. 14, 3, D, M, Q. He shouted them all out. He shouted out many, many letters and numbers. Then he walked up behind Tricia, and together they looked at the watery, messy board. Tricia knew that none of the letters or numbers looked like they should. She threw down the sponge, and she tried to run. But Mr. Falker caught her arm, and he sank down to his knees and in front of her, and he said, "You poor baby. You think you're dumb, don't you? How awful for you to be so alone and afraid." And she sobbed. "But little one, don't you understand? Don't you see? Letters or numbers, you don't see letters or numbers the way other people do. And you've gotten through school all this time and fooled many, many good teachers." And he smiled at her. "That took cunning and smartness and such bravery." And then he stood up and he finished washing the board. "We're going to change all that, little girl. We're going to teach you to read. I promise you that." Almost every day after school, she met Mr. Falker and Miss Plessy, a reading teacher. And they did a lot of things that she didn't even understand. At first, she made circles in the sand, and then a big sponge circle on the blackboard, going from left to right, left to right. And another day, they flicked letters on a screen, and Tricia shouted them out loud. Still other days, she worked with wooden blocks, and she built words, letters and letters and letters, words, 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 always sounding them out, and that felt good. But though she was reading words, She hadn't read a whole sentence, and deep down she knew she was still dumb. And then one spring day, it had been about 3 or 4 months since they had started, Mr. Falconer put a book in front of her. She'd never seen it before. He picked a paragraph in the middle of the page and he pointed at it. Almost as if it were magic, or if light poured into her brain, the words and the sentences started to take shape on the page as they never had done before. She marched them off to... Slowly, she read a sentence, and then another, and another. And finally, she'd read a paragraph, and she understood the whole thing. She didn't notice that Mr. Falconer and Miss Plessy had tears in their eyes. That night, Patricia ran home without stopping to catch her breath. She bounded up the front steps and she threw open the front door and she ran into the dining room to the kitchen. She climbed on the cupboard and she grabbed a jar of honey. She went to the living room and she found the book on the shelf, the very book her grandpa had showed her so many years ago. She spooned honey onto the cover and tasted the sweetness, and then said to herself, "The honey is the sweet, and so is knowledge. But knowledge is like the bee who made the honey. It has to be chased through the pages of a book." And then she held the book, honey and all, close to her chest. She could feel tears running down her cheeks, but they were not tears of sadness. She was happy, so very happy. The rest of the year became an odyssey of discovery and adventure for that little girl. She learned to love school, and I know because that little girl was me, Patricia Polacco, the author of the book. I saw Mr. Falker again sometime 30 years later at a wedding. I walked up to him and introduced myself, and at first he had difficulty placing me, but then I told him who I was and how he had changed my life so many years ago. He hugged me, and he asked me what I did for a living. "Why, Mr. Falker," I answered, "I make books for children." Thank you, Mr. Falker. Thank you.